All right. So, good morning. Welcome to Tuesday. Welcome to Tuesday. Today, what we'll do is we'll recap what we talked about yesterday in terms of the Great Depression. We'll talk a little bit more about, or we'll review what we talked about democracy and communism yesterday. We'll talk about what fascism is, and then we'll get to meet a real, well, I was going to say a real live fascist, but he's not live anymore, so it kind of doesn't count. So I'll have you read a little bit about a real live fascist, and then we'll talk a little bit about maybe modern fascism, but we'll see how we feel about that, and you'll understand what I mean in a bit. I'll also give you back your quizzes a little bit later, and we can review those. Yeah, so we've got a full day ahead of us, or a full class ahead of us. So Shania's here. Good morning to you, Shania. Rafin is here. Good morning to you, sir. Hadil is here. Good morning. And Kevin is here. Morning, Kevin. All right. So yesterday, if you will recall, we had kind of finished the Roaring '20s, and we talked about what happened in the Great Depression. And tell me a few of the things that cause this Great Depression, right? Where we have this drop in economic activity. Lots of people are out of work and not making any money, and the entire kind of global economy, but in particular the U.S. economy, is in the garbage can. What?
Because of credit.
Say again?
Because of credit.
Because of credit? How do you mean?
Like people used to take money from the banks and then they can pay later, but then they could destroy it, and then the bank started the money was like getting over and on.
Right. So people were. I'm just going to say hi to people, and I'll come back to you there. So Michaela's here. Good morning. Mohammed is here. Good morning. Ayushi is here. Also, good morning. And Abdul Rahman, good morning to you. Okay, so Aliana, sorry, you said that credit was a big issue, right? And it was a new thing. Today we're very used to credit cards, and we're very used to, most of our phone plans are technically credit, right? Because you pay for them at the end of the month, right? So we're very used to getting things right now and paying for them later on, right? But at the time, that was brand new. People didn't do that in the 1900s. They saved up if they wanted something, which sounds slow and torturous and very difficult to do, because we want instant gratification, right? We want the thing we want right now. So yeah, lots of people were buying things on credit, and one of the things they were buying on credit were stocks, right? They were buying investments. And so how did that become a problem? Mm-hmm.
So the stocks started to lose their values, and everyone started to sell, or at least they wanted to sell.
Mm-hmm.
There wasn't anyone getting money, so the stock market crashed.
Yep.
People went to take out their money out of the banks, and the banks they ran out of money. They didn't have any money, so they crashed as well.
Yep.
A lot of people lost their jobs because their bosses couldn't pay them anymore.
Yep.
Industry crashed. Everything crashed.
Everything, yeah. The whole thing collapses, right? Why were people kind of starting to sell their stocks in the first place?
So the demand was really low and the supply was really high, so also the production was too much.
Mm-hmm.
So industries weren't making enough profit to pay off their workers, so they had to let go some of the workers.
Yeah.
And as a result of that not making money and all of that, their stock values decreased. And yeah, people were paid like more money for the stocks, and now they're saying that they're dropping, so they want to sell them.
Yeah, yeah. So it was a time of excitement, right? And everything was going like crazy. People were producing like crazy, but without too much thought to, what was going to happen once sales, had peaked, right? And so markets were very unregulated, right? There wasn't a lot of government controls on the market, and people were, for a little while, they were just making crazy amounts of money because everything was going up and up and up. People were employed, they were making money, they were spending money that they had and money that they didn't have with credit. But like we mentioned, yeah, eventually you get to a point where everyone has bought a car, right? Everyone has a vacuum cleaner and doesn't need another one. And so, yeah, as sales start to peak and decline, people start to get laid off, stocks start to get sold, and eventually everybody starts to panic because, again, they've invested money in the stock market that they cannot afford to lose, which some people would argue is the sort of cardinal rule. If you want to invest in stocks and things and play the stock market, do not invest money that you only invest money that you can afford to lose. And so these people didn't do that because they borrowed money they didn't have, and so they couldn't afford to lose it. And when they tried to liquidate their shares, when they tried to sell them all off, everybody was selling, nobody was buying, and everything comes to a, crashing halt, right? So it's a pretty traumatic thing to have happen, especially after, probably a good 7 to maybe 10 years of, let the good times roll kind of excitement in the United States. And yeah, everything comes to a pretty crushing halt. And we mentioned again that the government didn't really do a very good job, either in the US or Canada, of dealing with the Depression, right? They thought the economy would fix itself, that you just had to let it go back to normal. They restricted their spending because that's kind of what we agreed you do when you lose your job. You restrict your spending. But again, we pointed out that's not a good thing for a government to do, because the more the government clamps down on spending, the less money is flowing in the system, and that just makes the whole thing worse, right? The government in a recession or in a depression, they need to get the money circulating again, right? And so what they need to do is pump money into the system, whether it's putting money directly in people's pockets, like CERB or whatever, or whether it's funding infrastructure projects to get people back to work. Whatever they choose to do, the government has to start putting money into the system to get it moving again. But unfortunately, that's not a lesson that was that people knew back in the 1930s, and so it took the government a good 4 or 5 years to realize that the Depression wasn't going to end on its own, and that they were actually going to have to do something. And again, as we mentioned before, really it's not going to get that much better until World War II begins, and that's going to pull the country out of this depression, unfortunately. Yeah, so economic lessons were learned, but yeah, a lot of people suffered for a long time, right, as a result. We also said that at the end of World War I, there was kind of 3 political systems in play, right? And so once upon a time, we just had monarchies in, I know we're kind of being Eurocentric here, but in Western Europe and North America, originally we had monarchies controlling the whole thing. Democracies start to kind of push their way in the 17 and 1800s. But here, in the 1900s, we have the birth of 2 new political systems, right? Communism and fascism. And so I showed you this yesterday just to kind of give you a little bit of a, when we were talking about this yesterday, we can see like liberals and conservatives, we can see left wing and right wing, and we can kind of see in general what the left wing and the right wing are about. How many people saw this and said, oh yeah, I know that already? Huh? Sort of?
No,
So what? What do you mean?
So what did we see?
So what did you see?
What is the question?
What is my question? Had you seen this, did you understand this before? Did you understand liberal, conservative, left wing, and right wing before or not? Is this new to you? What? Okay, that's good. So, yeah. But this is important, right? Because especially, definitely in the U.S. and Canada, in Western Europe, and particularly with what's going on in the United States, they are very highly polarized between the left and the right, right? And so you can see here some of the differences that that separate these 2 groups, but they are, they're not as far apart as some people would, or as it seems to be in the United States. In the United States, it seems like they are really worlds apart, right? The left and the right, the Republicans and the Democrats, that they can't agree on anything and they're just totally different parties. But in real life, they are both fairly close to the center. The Republicans are kind of leaning a little further right than they used to. Maybe the left is leaning a little further left than it used to as well, but they're not as far apart as sometimes it seems in the news. And definitely here in Canada, they're not that far apart either. And so there's not a, sorry, Justin Trudeau, but there's not a significant difference between, say, the Liberal Party and the NDP, you know, at the federal level. They're both a little bit, they're leaning a little bit left, but there's not a huge difference, especially when you're talking about communism and fascism, which exist kind of at the edges of the spectrum. So we said very quickly that liberals here and people on the left wing were a lot more comfortable with increased involvement in people's social lives. I'm just looking at that, and actually I should change my arrows. My arrows are wrong. My arrows are the opposite of what they should be. So people on the left wing are very comfortable with with the government involvement in their economic life, and so they're very comfortable with social programs. They're very comfortable with socialized medicine, which is what we have up here in Canada, right? Because we all pay into our healthcare system, and then when we need to go to the doctor, it's free, right? So that's a socialist idea right there. People on the left are comfortable with that, but they're not too interested in people's social lives. So they're not interested in maintaining tradition. They tend not to be overly religious. They tend to be very accepting of difference and diversity, usually, right? And then on the right wing, we find people that are less comfortable with the government involved in their economic life, and so they kind of want low taxes. They don't want to pay for social programs. We see that in the United States. There's a percentage of Americans who don't want socialized medicine. They think people should just buy their own insurance, right? That's kind of more of a right-wing idea. And socially, they are interested in, or the government is interested in the people's social life. So they're interested in maintaining tradition. They're interested in they're interested in sort of more conservative, traditional values, maintaining the status quo. They actually tend to be a little harsher on crime and punishment, right-wingers. But that's kind of the difference in, as we know it to operate in the West anyway. So yeah, we said democracy is where people have the power and they either vote directly or, more commonly in the modern world here, we elect someone to vote for us, right? And so here in this riding, this is, what is this called? I think this is Vancouver Mount Pleasant, I think is what this riding is called. And so on October 24th, I will, actually that's not true because I requested a mail-in ballot. But when I get my mail-in ballot, I will select a candidate for this riding, and then that person, if they're elected, will go to Victoria and they will vote for me. And every time they're going to vote, they'll call me first and check and see what I want them to do. Definitely not. But we will elect someone from this area, and they will go to Victoria and represent us, in theory anyway. So we said the important part of democracy is that there is a rule of law to which everybody is subservient, right? Even the President of the United States is is below the law, right? Everyone has to obey the law as it exists. That's how democracies function, and that's how people's rights are respected, right? If anyone's able to go above the law and do what they want, you're starting to lose your democracy, right? And we said it was usually paired with capitalism, where regular people own the means of production. And this is what most nations get at the end of World War I, because, of course, democratic nations kind of win World War I, and so they install democratic governments in West Europe. We talked about communism a little bit, and it was an exploitive system, or at least it was according to Karl Marx, right? So he said that the factory workers, the proletariat, were being exploited by the bourgeoisie, right? Because the bourgeoisie, the factory owners, were keeping all of the profit from the people's labor, right? And Marx said that's not fair. The people should share in that profit equally. And so he argued for a communist revolution. The people would realize that they were being exploited. They would overthrow those bourgeoisie jerks and take control of the means of production and share the profits equally amongst themselves, right? And again, of course, we know it's not quite so simple in real life, or at least it hasn't been. We'll come back to that when we talk about the story of Russia. But that was what Marx was arguing for in his writing anyway. Yeah, and so here actually maybe we'll just make a little distinction between communism and socialism, because sometimes we hear both of those words and sometimes they overlap. Socialism is kind of the economic system, okay? So that's an economic system where the state owns the means of production, or state-owned businesses, and then people, things are distributed to the people based on their need, okay? So communism is where you have the political system on top of that administers that system. And so, you can have elements of socialism in your country without having a communist country. And so that's what we have here in Canada. We've had socialist parties form governments in provinces before. I think in Saskatchewan in the kind of mid-1900s, like the 1930s and 40s, there was actually a socialist party who was able to gain power. And one of the things that came out of that is our healthcare system. And again, that's a socialist idea, right? We all pay into it and we all get out what we need. That's pure socialism right there. But again, we're not a communist country. We're nowhere close. But you can borrow socialist ideas here and there, which Canada has. Of course, if you talk about socialism in the States, they get the heebie-jeebies. They get a little uncomfortable often. Not every American, but some Americans get very uncomfortable at the concept of socialism. But up here in Canada, we're okay with some of it because it definitely works for us, I think.
So basically socialism just cares about the economy?
Socialism is an economic system, so it's just concerned with economic matters, not so much political. So the political system is where you get into communism, where the socialist system is expanded to kind of all corners of the state, and you have a one-party system that rules over that. Then you have communism. But again, you can borrow little pieces of socialism and get away with it, and you don't have to be communist, which we're not. Although there is a communist party in Canada, believe it or not, but they have like 300 members or something. They're very small. Okay, so we talked about that. We talked about that yesterday too, and that brings us to Ahmad's favorite, because he lights up every time he sees the word fascism, which is a little concerning, but that's okay. Fascism is a little more difficult to define, okay? Because fascism comes out of democracy, okay? And it is a political system that kind of differs a lot depending on who's in charge. And it differs because it's actually rejecting more things than it's accepting, right? So democracy has this kind of ideology behind it, right? The power to the people, the rule of law, right? Communism has this kind of ideology, or socialism has this ideology behind it where, everyone is kind of an equal partner in the state and everybody gives as much as they can and they get as much as they need back, in theory. And fascism is a little bit more complicated because, again, it's born out of a period where people are rejecting a lot of things, okay? And so you can see here fascism is often about more what it rejects than what it accepts. So fascists have no patience for kings and queens and monarchs. They have no patience for democracy. They don't like decadence or style or kind of leisure or things like that. They don't like egalitarianism or individualism. They are, well, let's keep going and I can define it. Fascism comes out of Western Europe in the 1930s, and it comes out of a faltering confidence in democracy. So, like I said, lots of those newly created countries in Western Europe, they get democracies of their own. They don't really know how to use them. They're pretty inefficient, but it's a pretty difficult time, right? The war is over. You're entering into a global economic depression, and you have all of these democratic governments that are not functioning very well. And so, people kind of thought, oh, we're getting democracy, right? Democracy is great. Democracy is power to the people. But what they kind of find is that democracy sometimes doesn't work very well. Things take a long time. There's a lot of arguing. There's a lot of voting. Sometimes things don't pass, and you have to sort of rework the thing to try to get it to pass the second vote. Democracy is really not that efficient, and it's not that quick. It's not good at making quick decisions. And so as a result, people who are economically struggling in Western Europe and in Germany a little later on, they start to turn to something like this because they're frustrated with how slowly democracy moves and how inefficient and ineffectual it seems to be. Some people are also worried in this period of the threat of communism or Bolshevism. And so the revolution that happens in Russia in 1917, where the Bolsheviks, the communist Bolsheviks take power in Russia, that kind of freaks everyone out in Europe. Everyone's a little bit worried that a similar communist revolution could happen in their country as well. And so there are fears of that in Germany. And in fact, the communists almost overthrow the government at one point, but it's foiled. They're worried about it in Italy. They're worried about it in other Eastern European countries as well. People are doubtful of democracy and they don't like how it's working, but they're also worried that their country could have a communist revolution, and they don't want that either. And so out of that kind of period, or out of that sort of situation, comes the fascists, okay? And so the fascists are usually led by a charismatic leader, right? So fascists are very interested in a strong man, and it's a man, a strong man who has the vision and the determination to take the country into the future. And so the fascists are conservative in some ways, right? They're very traditional in their values, but also they're definitely looking forward, okay? So they're, huh?
Are they elected by no other?
We'll get there, but no. Well, yes, but no.
How they do decide that he's our leader?
We'll get to it. We'll get to it. So usually you wind up with this charismatic leader, and they do have an eye on the past in terms of tradition, but they also have an eye on the future, and they imagine that there's going to be this glorious future for their country. And I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but fascists often use they often use the same narrative, the same story, okay? And the story is this, okay? Once upon a time we were great, okay? Our nation. Once upon a time our nation was great, but then something happened, okay? Could be anything, all right? It could be a depression, it could be a war, it could be, exploitation by another country, anything. But then something happened. But we will be great again, and I will take you there. That is the basic fascist narrative. And so, as we'll see very shortly, Benito Mussolini is going to use that story. Adolf Hitler is going to use that story. Other leaders that I'm sure you're thinking of have also used that story. But it's a very traditional narrative. And of course, the details change, right, depending on the country and the time period. But it's, once we were great, then something happened, but we will be great again, and I will take you there. It is a very familiar story. It has been heavily used throughout history. And
No, he reflects half.
Maybe. Is that Trump's story?
No,
Yes.
we use it as a nation all the time.
No,
so-
he's just.
Iran does?
Yeah, we're like 80 million people, we're all fascists, we all use the same story.
Well, it depends, right? This is a story that a leader would use, right? And of course, I think it would be only reasonable for people of a nation who, look at the past and saw it as glorious and looked at their present and said, oh, not so great, but we will be great again. I think that's okay. That's an okay idea to have, right? You always want to strive to improve your country's standard of living and situation. But the fascist creates that narrative and then says, but I'm the only one who can take you there, right? I have the plan, I have the vision,
Just one man.
just one man, right? And so, what? Well, and we'll get to that. Right, so fascists here are out on the right wing, and sometimes it's tempting to think of putting them with communism, right? Because both communist states and fascist states usually wind up with a single leader. Those leaders are usually authoritarian, and so they're the ones making all the decisions. And usually the system is rather restrictive for the people, and so the good of the state comes before the good of individual people. Okay, so individual rights don't matter, it's the good of the state. That's how, so communists and fascists are similar in that way, in terms of putting the country or the nation or the state first, and they usually have an authoritarian leader, right? And of course here with democracy, we have the opposite, right? We don't have an authoritarian leader, hopefully. We have elected representatives that vote, and we care about individual rights, right? We try to take care of the country as a whole, but everybody's rights have to be respected, right? People are equal before the law. So it's kind of, they're opposites in that way, fascism and communism and democracy. But again, those are the similarities between fascism and communism, and sometimes people want to stick them together. But actually they're quite different, because the fascists are more interested in tradition. They're more interested in restoring a kind of an older version of what the society was. They tend not to play a significant role in the economy, right? Communist countries, the government controls the entire economy, right? Everything belongs to the government, they control it. But with fascists, they usually have a lot less control in the economy itself. But law and order are important to fascists, and to the point where fascists are usually very comfortable using violence against their own people. And that's another mark of a fascist as well. Fascists can be violent against other nations, but they can also be violent against their own people, which you don't usually see in democracy, and sometimes you see in communism. So that brings us to this gentleman here. Arguably, the first kind of fascist to appear on scene, or at least the first fascist that we'll deal with here, is Benito Mussolini. And so he'll become, as you can see, he kind of becomes leader of this National Fascist Party. They manage to get themselves into power in the early 1920s. He'll be prime minister all that time, and he'll kind of rule as a dictator, as an authoritarian dictator in a kind of a fascist, way. He very much used that narrative of, we were great once, now we're not, but we will be again. So Benito kind of often referenced back to ancient Rome, right? Because Italy has this, great heritage of, the world's first mega empire, right? When, a little less than 2,000 years ago, 20% of the world's population lived in the Roman Empire, right? And so he connects the present to the past, to this glorious past, and says, but we're going to go there again, right? We're going to create a new, almost a new empire, a new Italian empire. And so, yeah, he uses this story very heavily. But here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to spend a little time with these fascists and see what they're like. And so I would like you to read just these 2 pages. And it's just a little biography of Benito Mussolini and how he comes to power. And so there's that to read, and I've got a few questions, and that will lead us into the next kind of fascist thing that we do, okay? So I'll just give you 10 minutes with that, because it's a short section, and then we'll talk, okay? forgot to unmute. Yeah, so Mussolini is a bit of a political opportunist. He starts out on the left and then he jumps over to the right when it seems to be useful to him to do so. So based on this section of the text here, who were the fascists blaming for the sort of economic and social chaos that Italy was experiencing in the 1920s? Who was to blame? Huh? Democracy was. Why is democracy at fault here?
Because it gave the state over to ignorant masses.
Power.
Yeah, the power was given to the ignorant masses. What do they kind of mean by that?
Daily people, usual people.
Usual people? What?
Like normal people.
No, normal people, right? And ignorant means,
Uneducated?
yeah, uneducated.
So you want people who are just
Yeah, so the fascists kind of look at the people with contempt, right? Because they look at the state of Italy and they're like, you know what the problem is? You give power to the people, but the people don't know what they're doing, right? They're all uneducated. They don't know how to run an economy. So like, why would you ask these people to run a country when they don't know anything about it, right? They're all idiots, is what is what the fascists are kind of saying, right? And so again, they have this view that, you know, you need one strong man, right? A guy with vision who's going to make clear decisions and move the nation.
back then it was kind of okay, but now it is.
Yeah, and move the nation ahead. Did they say that in this article, number 2? What argument was used to discredit liberal democratic practices? Is that the argument they're talking about, the ignorant masses thing, or is there something else? Did I miss it?
They didn't talk about it.
Help me out here. What do you see? An argument used to discredit liberal democratic practices. I think that might be it. I think it's that ignorant mass. The ignorant masses thing is the argument. So, what would someone who believes in democracy say in response to that? To these fascists? Because to some degree they are correct, right? So most people who vote in any election don't really know too much about running a country. I definitely don't. I do not know how to run a country, or do I? I do not know how to run a country, but yet I'm going to vote anyway, right? So what would someone who believes in democracy say in response to this ignorant mass comment? You know, I know. You don't believe in democracy? Why not?
Because the only democracy that was established in my country has failed, and one is the name of terrorists.
Okay. Be that as it may, there are other democracies elsewhere that are operating reasonably well.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't like the way democracy is being.
Why not?
Some are some stupid. Some are good.
It's true, right? Democracy is fraught with, yeah,
It's worse when they bring the
It's not like we are
control
controlling
the state.
it's a difficult one. What?
They bring these, I don't know, religious studied people and just throw it all over the state. It doesn't work out.
Boy, is anyone going to speak up for democracy here?
I mean, I agree with the general idea of democracy, but the fact that it's integrated with religion in most countries is wrong.
So you would argue for a separation of church and state?
Yeah.
Yes.
There's no technical thinking. That's not
It's not possible.
Just to be real,
A separation of church and state.
They've done it all over the place.
It is in Canada. The religious leaders have no direct power in Canada.
I personally believe in monarchy. There because they could, what I'm going to say may backfire, but the main point is that when you're a monarch, you look at the country and say, yeah, that's mine. So what everyone wants with what is theirs, they want it to be better than everyone else's. So what you do, you improve it. Or you can backfire as a monarch, say, okay, so it's mine, I'll do whatever I want, you can't tell me anything.
Right, and that's always the difficult point of having one person in charge, right? If you get somebody who's really great, then yeah, everything is great. If you get someone who is an awful ruler, everything is awful. Yeah, so it's a lot to bet on, right? You're betting your entire country on one person, right, making the right decisions. Which is not to say that democracies always make the right decisions either, right?
democracy fully exists in person.
Yeah, remember, if you were in my comparative cultures class last term, we talked about the Peloponnesian War, and the Athenians vote to start a war with the Spartans, a war that ultimately destroys them, right, and their empire. And so, but they voted to do that, right? That was democracy's choice to enter into that war that led to their ruin, basically. So democracies don't always make good choices either.
This may sound a bit nerdy, but are you sure that Athens was actually destroyed by Sparta? Because Thebes got in and then they kicked Sparta's butt.
My remembering it is that Sparta defeats Athens with the help of the Persians.
What?
Yeah, with a Persian navy.
I mean, they do send help, they do defeat Athens, but Athens doesn't just go boom and destroy.
No, they're not. They're not.
Goes off.
No. Athens is not over, but they lose their empire. They lose their sort of military might, and they continue to be an important city, but not kind of. They become a different city than they were prior to. But it's.
Sparta also falls.
What's that?
Sparta also falls.
True. But one way or the other, Athens voted to do that thing. My point was that democracies don't always make good decisions, is my point. Okay, so what's the fascist view between the state and the individual? Right, so the state takes precedence, right? Not so much here in Canada, right? In Canada, everyone is subject to the law, and people can challenge the state in court, right? So here in a democracy, in principle anyway, our individual rights are respected, and they are as important as the state itself. But in fascist systems, the state comes first. Your individual rights, if they don't interfere with the functioning of the state, you can have them. If they do, you can't have them, right? So the state takes precedence. What do you think are the advantages of such a view, of putting the state before the individual?
One individual.
Huh?
One individual. Or one.
Well, between a what's the advantage of the state being the priority over individual rights?
Some states when you start this because they would be hurting a single person or group of people.
Sorry, say that one more time.
So usually when the individuals are hired in the state,
Yeah.
if the state is going to do something that may affect a group of individuals in a negative way, that group of individuals can stand up and say, no, you can't do that. But when the state is above them, they can do it all the same, and that may be good for the rest of the people behind the same stuff.
Right. So putting the state above the individual ensures that the good of the state is maintained, and hopefully that translates to a good outcome for most of the people. Hopefully. Yeah. Okay. Possible. Other advantages of putting the state over the individual? What's that?
Minority gets the advantage.
Minorities get an advantage. Perhaps.
In fascist regimes.
What's that?
In fascist regimes?
Yeah.
Anyone gets an advantage, really.
Yeah, because the state is the priority, so
Yeah.
explain that.
Means that everyone will be equal.
Everyone would be equal though, because they do what's better for the state. And everyone being equal
That
is probably
results to
better.
the, that goes to the people. So
The thing I might kind of toss into this conversation here is the idea that fascism is often also called supremacist nationalism, right? So the fascists often aren't just thinking of their country, they're not patriotic, they're thinking of their nation, their people. And so Benito Mussolini here is thinking about the Italians, right? Not everybody who lives in Italy, the Italians, right? Hitler's doing the same. He's not thinking of the people who live in Germany, he's thinking about the pure-blooded Germans, right? And so minority or majority, it kind of depends if the state sees you as a member of the nation. If they do, then you will probably be a little bit better off. But again, if you're a member of a minority, if you're seen as not part of the nation, then things are not going to go very well for you because the state puts even the sort of good of the state before individual rights of its citizens, of its actual nation. Never mind if you're not in the nation. If you're not in the nation, you're barely worth considering to a fascist. So for a minority, it might actually be worse. It can become more developed. In what way?
Like if you're like overstand like this building or state and you don't focus on the small problems that people have and like you can focus on like the income that they're getting and
I guess so, right? Looking after everyone's individual rights is a time-consuming pain in the butt, right? It's a lot of work. You get tripped on all these things. But if you simply put the state first, it's much easier to make decisions and to do things if you don't have to worry about everyone's individual rights, right? You can just go ahead and do whatever is good for the state, right? And so I guess that's another advantage too, is that fascist states can be much more efficient, right? They can move much more quickly because the leader can just say, this is what we're doing, go do it. Nobody's individual rights will get in the way, and it just gets done, right? Although, granted, sometimes the thing that gets done is something that shouldn't get done because it's awful, but still, things move much quicker, right? Decisions can happen quickly, and there are no, pesky individual rights
There's
to
lots of disadvantages.
stand in the way. What?
There's lots of disadvantages.
Sure. What are disadvantages?
No, it just depends on the one person.
You can have something like the Holocaust.
So one person has to make all decisions.
It's
for
true.
the state, for the country.
It's true. Authoritarian leaders generally like to do that, though. But horrible things can happen, right? So again, decisions can happen very quickly. Nobody's individual rights need to be consulted or to be maintained. But of course, you can have horrible things happen like genocides, right? Like the Holocaust. And again, if it's your individual rights that you're losing, that might be a big deal to you, right? So it's one thing to say the state goes before individual rights, but what if they're actually your rights, right? That
They care less about the people. If someone is running, and one person is running.
they think about the people more in an abstract sense, I would say, rather than worrying about individual human lives. They are more, and this is where it says here in the text. It says they see the state as, what does it say? the belief that the state was greater than its individual parts. Or no, greater than its individual part, and that the state was organic and had a life of its own. So here in Canada, we kind of think of the Canadian people, but we're thinking of 36 million individual persons living in this country. But the fascists are almost thinking about the people in kind of an abstract, general sense, because again, they're not too worried about individual lives. They're worried about the health of the state as this sort of, organic, abstract entity, right? So it's a little different in terms of the way that they see the people that live in their country, right?
It does work out pretty well.
What's that?
It does work out pretty well.
Well,
Take away the fact that Germany was eventually destroyed. Hitler took a ruler and made it to something that conquered all Europe. Now the conquest part may not be really good, but the others, they were pretty messed up. They were pretty well.
I'd love to have that conversation with you, but we're not there yet. Okay, let's take a break, and then we'll talk about more fascism stuff when we come back, okay? Okay. So, I asked you to read this very short section. We got a very quick introduction to this Benito Mussolini fellow. We hear that, or I may have told you, he had an earlier career, or he had a few earlier careers as an actor, which didn't work out for him, and he wrote for a few newspapers, and he was kind of a provocative journalist. He kind of just said whatever he felt like. He didn't really bother checking sources. He just wrote what he thought he wanted to create a stir. He starts out as kind of a left-wing socialist, and then he finds himself on the right as one of the leaders of this National Fascist Party, and then he finds his way into the office of prime minister, and he pretty quickly converts Italy's constitutional monarchy into a dictatorship in which he has sole power, right? And so what I wanted to ask you was this: does he remind you of anyone?
That's so obvious.
No?
That's obvious.
I'm not trying to make you say anything, but I feel like the fact that you brought him up suggests that. Well, let's look at it this way, okay?
They look like brothers.
They look like brothers. Mussolini looks like one of those like Easter Island statues to me. I don't know. The other guy looks like an orange clown, but that's another thing. So, similarities, okay, at least as far as I see them. You may see others. But I would say that these two are similar in that, A, neither of them has a really strong ideology guiding their actions, right? And so for Trump is a Republican, but he kind of just says and does whatever he wants, right? He doesn't strongly adhere to conservative politics. He's not very ideological in any way. He kind of just does whatever he wants, or he says whatever he thinks will suit him at the moment. And similarly, we see that Mussolini was like that too. He was kind of a left-wing socialist, and then he switched sides and started railing against the socialists in speeches. And so both kind of are capable of saying and doing whatever seems to suit them in the moment without any strong adherence to being conservative or being liberal or being communist, right? Both of them are actors on a stage, right? So we said that Mussolini actually had a career as an actor before, and if you see him speak, he's a very charismatic speaker, right? People pay attention to him and listen to what he says because he's a good speaker. I have trouble saying this about Donald Trump, but thousands of people turn up to see him speak at his rallies, right? Even in a pandemic. I don't think the people showing up there are laughing at him,
No, they're not.
except when he's trying to be funny.
Have you seen the comment section?
I don't really have enough time to waste it on seeing Donald Trump.
No, I go there in the comment section. The supporters are really strong.
The supporters, yeah, but yeah, so the people who are showing up to see him want to hear him speak, right? And so again, I don't think he's a very strong speaker, but for arguably millions of people across the United States, he is a charismatic speaker that people pay attention to. Actor on a stage, he was on a reality show, right? Donald Trump was on a reality show called The Apprentice, where he played a successful businessman, which he is not. But he pretended to be.
Well, he's also in the WWE, right?
Huh?
WWE, the fighting thing.
Oh, yeah, I guess. Yeah, that doesn't count. That's ridiculous. The wrestling thing?
Wrestling, yeah, he was in the wrestling. He was the commentator, yeah.
What?
Yeah, haven't you seen the video?
I thought he wrestled. I'm like, what?
He never wrestled.
Trump, the guy with the wig?
No,
He has a wig.
I think that's his hair.
It actually flew off.
I don't know how. Yeah, I don't know how it works, that hair, but I think it's his hair. I think. Anyway, his hair aside, both of them could be considered actors on a stage, right? They're very charismatic speakers. Mussolini has a career as an actor before this, and arguably so does Trump, right? He has his own TV show for a while. Yeah, again, they're both very public speakers, forceful public speakers, but they say very little of substance, right? It's all very grandiose, or it's, you know, mocking or whatever, but neither of them really say anything. And again, if you listen to either of them, not much really is said.
They use very simple words.
They do. And I think you could say that their views about the world and the actions that they take spring more from a desire to kind of gratify their ego rather than, or to get revenge against someone or something rather than to do the thing that is in the best interest of the country, right? They're both operating from a very kind of selfish, egoistic perspective rather than trying to care for the nation, right? To care for the country. So I don't know. Are these two similar or are they different? And so let me ask you one more question then. If you believe me and if you see some similarities between these two leaders here, Mussolini and Trump, does that make Donald Trump a fascist?
Inside.
Is he a fascist?
He's a fascist.
Hasn't really changed their constitution yet, but he does write a whole lot of executive orders.
He hasn't changed the Constitution, but
He writes a lot of executive orders.
writes a lot of executive orders, yeah. Okay.
It
Does-
doesn't look like he cares about the people.
What's that?
It doesn't look like he cares about people.
Doesn't look like he cares about other people very much.
I'd say yes, actually, because he's mostly focused on furthering the agenda of America as a country, not looking at the people specifically. So I would say, yeah.
That's true. Although, in another way, that's the job of really every country's leader, right? Is to advance their country's interests. That's why we hired Justin Trudeau, right? He's supposed to advance Canada's interests, right? I don't know. Is he a fascist or is he not?
Yeah, inside Trump, inside his mind, he's a fascist. But he can't do that.
You-
Due to the sanctions.
You know what's happening inside his mind? Good for you, because I'm confused. I don't know what's going on in there.
He is a dictator, that's for sure. We all, that's,
He wants to be a.
it's obvious that he wants to be a dictator and is trying to as much as possible with all those orders. But I don't know.
Does that make him a fascist?
Yes,
He's a
that,
nationalist, for sure.
I don't really think he's a fascist.
he's a fascist, but he's about to get.
At first glance, which is basically what we're doing here, who would put up their hand and say, "Yeah, I think Donald Trump is a fascist"? 3, 4, 5. Ashley, is your hand up or not really? No? No? Who thinks he is not a fascist? That's like a half. 1. Okay. And other people are not entirely sure.
Okay, so let's start again exactly explaining what a fascist is. So fascist is a guy who's very nationalist, who just cares about a bunch, just a group of his people, and they're to heck with the rest, as they would think.
Okay.
They rather blow up everything other than give them their powers. They want to advance their countries. They don't care about whether other people would starve to death or whatever. Right? I mean, most countries do that. Small
Is there a
right?
group of,
Want to advance themselves.
is there a group of people, I thought it's putting the country above the individual.
They do bring the state above the individual. Yeah, he does that. Trump does that, but he doesn't really have the other part. Like, even if he wants to do that, he can't do it, so he's not really a fascist in the way that we would see.
What other
You know,
horses?
he might be like even,
Finish, sorry.
he might be in his, he might in his head be a fascist. We don't really know that for sure until he does something that is like for sure going to be an act of fascism. Right? He did do some stupid things which appear to be of his own interest, like the assassination in early 2020, the drone.
Of al-Baghdadi,
What? No.
the assassination of.
The general during the IRGC guy. But then Iran retaliated by
Yeah, that was al-Baghdadi, wasn't it? No, who was that? Soleimani. Sorry, who was I thinking? Oh, I was thinking of the ISIS. No, the
Yeah,
Taliban. The Taliban guy, right?
Taliban is Bin Laden.
Yeah, but there was another. But al-Baghdadi was like another.
And he was the ISIS.
He was. Oh, he's an ISIS guy. It's so hard for me to keep all these guys sorted out.
Yeah, it's okay. I mean, they're all our neighbors, so.
No, they're not. No, they're not.
No, like, come on, because al-Baghdadi would be to our west, the military
Yeah,
would be to
with
our
him
east, and
Yeah, but that's a long.
just around.
You know, what I believe ISIS thinking, it just Americans, they made it up. If the ISIS, they're true ISIS, they could have given the, Arabic name.
Okay, we're not getting into
So
ISIS.
obvious, ISIS.
We're not getting into ISIS right now.
I don't think it's a fascist movement.
Michaela asked the question here, what's the difference between a dictatorship and fascism? And so that's a tricky question, right? So I think dictatorship simply means that you have one person kind of calling the shots, right? You have one person in power making the decisions. And it doesn't say anything else about what the political or economic system of the country is. Fascism gives you a little more idea of what, how the state is run, but fascism usually has a dictator associated with it, a single person in power.
So I think that would be like, when you have a dictator, you would know that should anyone in the country revolt against them, they'll brutally suppress them either by killing them or any other brutal way. Dictators are less likely to take aggressive actions against foreign nations, whereas they're less like them, not saying that they won't. But the fascists are like, they could do that, it's not a big deal to them.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know about how.
Because we've seen dictators all around the world, and they all that they care is to secure the power in their country and just suppress whoever tries to say no, you're a dictatorship. But fascists, they kick their ass.
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah, maybe. I'm not really sure if there's if that's an element. I don't know how, say, a political scientist would differentiate between, because fascism is kind of a political, somewhat economic system. Dictatorship is kind of a political system, but again, it doesn't tell you much else about what's going on except for the fact that you have a single person in power making all the decisions. But you are right about the fact that, yeah, they don't tolerate any challenge to that power. If you try to challenge the power, you will probably be imprisoned or killed. And yeah, I think you would probably be right to say too that dictators tend to be concerned with maintaining their power rather than asserting themselves with foreign nations. But of course, sometimes that is politically useful, right? So sometimes starting a war with someone else is politically useful. It's definitely worked well for Kim Jong-un, who hasn't started a war, but has antagonized other countries in ways that have benefited him. He's still a dictator.
These people know nothing about what is on the other side of the border.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very useful tool of the dictator, right? Is disinformation or propaganda, right? Very useful, which we'll talk about more with Russia and a little bit with Germany. Okay. Here's where I'm going with this. Because the micropaper I'm going to assign you here is based on is this question, basically. I want you to answer this question in a short paper. Should we see Donald Trump as a fascist?
Yes, that's a good point.
Should we see him? So obviously we have all rushed to judgment here about whether he is or isn't, but I would like you to consider this question in a little more detail, okay? So let me show you what I have in mind here. I'm going to tell you in just one second. Let's see, here it is. Here it is. I'm going to switch to this and put it on the screen. Not that. Okay. So here, is that too big? Yeah, a little bit. Okay, here's what I'm going to ask you to do. So I'm calling these little things micropapers. Sorry, that should be 1, not 2. My apologies. I want you to write a short paper for me, and it'll be about 700 words. And so if you use 12-point font, which you should, or 11 or 12-point font, and if you single or 1.5 space, I think that works out to be about 1.5 pages. So it's not excessively long, but it's long enough to actually say something. Last term I tried to do just a page, but a page is too short. You can't really say anything in a page. So 1.5 pages is a little easier to say something. And of course, I want you to write this short paper. I want it to have a short introduction and maybe a couple of paragraphs or so, depending on what you think, and a short little conclusion. And then I want to see you properly cite sources, okay? Again, I want you to create an argument in this paper. I want you to argue something with a conclusion and premises for me. And so I'm asking you this question: should we think of Donald Trump as a fascist? What is one conclusion that you might argue in your paper? We should not view Donald Trump as a fascist. There's a perfectly defensible conclusion, I think, anyway. What would be another conclusion? We should definitely think of Donald Trump as a fascist, right? So those are two possible conclusions that you could argue. You could also argue sort of more of a middle ground, right? If you have a more complex argument you want to make, or if you have different views. What's that? Yes, let me get there. So to help you out here, I'm going to give you 2 articles, okay? And so one of those articles says that, or tries to argue that yes, Donald Trump is a fascist. The second article argues no, Donald Trump is not a fascist, okay? And then I'd like you to find a third article of your own. So the 2 articles I have are very, very short. Are you like wincing at this? Or are you okay with this? Yeah. Or is it going to be okay?
Hopefully, yeah.
It's going to be just fine. The articles I have are very, very short and very easy to read. And so I'll want you to find a third, similarly short one, but also one that is credible, right? One that's, believable and of decent quality, okay? So you'll use these articles, and you will craft a little argument of your own, and you'll answer this question for me. Yes, we should think of Donald Trump as a fascist. No, we should not think of him as a fascist. Or if you have a more complex argument you want to make, yes but no, or no but yes, you can do that too. Again, I want it to be about 700 words in length, which is about 1.5 pages. You will need to cite all of your sources in MLA format, please and thank you, which we can talk about tomorrow. This is kind of what I want to see, okay? So I want to see you be able to find a good source, a good article to add. Again, I have 2 sources for you, pre-selected for your convenience, but I want you to be able to find another one that is decent and credible for this assignment. I want to see you be able to take these 3 articles and synthesize them into something that is your own, okay? And so you will use either the information in these articles or some of the arguments they're making, and you will fuse them into your own. Yes, Amanda?
Are we limited to 3 sources?
You are not limited to them. 3 will be enough for this exercise, but if you want to add something else in, you're very welcome to. Okay? I don't want it to become more than it should be, but you're very welcome to if you want. Yeah, I want to see your critical thinking. I want to see you create a logical, valid argument for me, just like we did with the coffee argument and with others that you built. And I want to see you kind of express your own thoughts and use some of the things that we've talked about in History 12 here so far, okay? So I'm not necessarily looking for facts and information. I'm looking for you to be able to take some information, take some pieces of arguments, and fuse them into something that is your own, okay? So here's what we'll do in order to proceed with this paper, okay? So I have 2 articles that I provided for you, and I think maybe what we'll do is tomorrow we'll read both of them together, okay? Just to kind of ease into this process, we'll read them both together and we'll talk a little bit about what the arguments are, okay? I'll talk a little bit tomorrow about citation and finding good sources and paraphrasing and plagiarism and essay structure. I'll talk about all of that tomorrow to help you out as well. And then, of course, I will set you loose. And I think that should be enough to get you on the right track. Yeah, and then I'd like it to be due in about a week, if that's okay. And so again, this doesn't have to be, gigantic. It should be a short paper. I'm giving you most of what you need already. You just need to find one thing and then put it together in a way that makes some sort of sense and shows me that you understand what's being argued and that you can kind of make an argument of your own. Okay? Yes? No? You're okay? When I grade this, hang on a second here. When I grade this, I'm going to use this right here. There it is. I'm going to use this right here. And so it's a very simple marking guide. I'm looking for your critical thinking skills. I'm looking for you to make a good argument based on the sources that you have found. I am looking for you to communicate well, so to have a paper that has good structure and that has decent grammar and spelling. Again, I know that for some of you, English is your second language, and so I am always cognizant of that. But still, you have to write as well as you can, right? And then sources. If you have a good source and if you cite it well, then that's what I'm marking, okay? So both this and this are posted in Microsoft Teams. So under the Files section, you'll see there's a new folder there called Assignments, and so these things are in there. Also what's in there, if it helps you, I don't know if it will or not, but if it helps you, let me just go there. Files. Oops. Teams. Yeah, so if it helps you in assignments here, I've got a couple of other things too. So there's a paragraph graphic organizer. And so if you are kind of struggling with your paragraph writing, this can help you. It's very kind of step-by-step and cookie cutter. If you don't need such a thing, just ignore it. But if you need a little help with your paragraphs, you can use it. It's helpful. It works, right? It's not fancy, but it's definitely usable. And the other thing that's in here too, if it helps you, is transition words. And so sometimes this can be helpful. I'm just going to blow this up a little bit. I'm going to blow it up a little more. Sometimes these can be helpful if you are looking for ways to start your next sentence, right? And so this will help you transition between words, between phrases, between paragraphs. And so again, if these are helpful to you, then they're there for you. If you're looking at those things and saying, wow, that's very Mickey Mouse, then just ignore them and move on with, sorry, that's how I say overly simple. Yeah, if you think they're a little too, or if you think they're a little too simple for you, if you think they're a little too Mickey Mouse, then just ignore them and move on with your writing. But if they're useful to you, they are there, okay? So you can look those things over. I'm just going to come back here.
What are the 2 articles?
The 2 articles are, we will read them tomorrow, okay? So they are, if you are interested, they are in Microsoft Teams already. So if you want to read ahead, you are very welcome to. But we'll read them, we will read at least one of them tomorrow, figure out the argument, and that will kind of get the ball rolling for you, okay? And then I'll have some other things to share with you tomorrow about, about plagiarism and paraphrasing and finding sources and citing them and all that kind of stuff. So I'll have that for you tomorrow as well. But until then, I think that's all I have for you. Is that all I have for you?
No, tests.
Oh, yeah. Okay. I will hand those back to you. People online, we'll review that tomorrow too. But we got a lot to do tomorrow. We'll review that tomorrow too, but people in class, I'll hand them back to you. And then we'll talk, first thing tomorrow, we'll talk about the quizzes, okay? So online people, it was a pleasure having you here, and we'll see you tomorrow, and we'll talk more about the paper assignment, and we'll read those articles. So I'll say goodbye to you now. So bye, see you tomorrow.